Mexico was and is uniquely part of a greater culture and civilization. All Mexican intellectuals have recognized and admitted the enormous problem of Mexican identity for almost 200 years without recognizing or admitting the root of the problem itself. The Spanish Empire grafted its civilization onto many quite different human stocks from Patagonia to the Rio Bravo, and onto many variant basic human societies. The graft was dominant everywhere in the things that compose civilization: language, law, religion, organization, ethic. Far too much attention has been paid intellectually to the Amerindian trunk of Hispanic America, which has sometimes actually prevented Hispanic American intellectuals from seeing their problems for what they are: Hispanic problems. Strangely enough, in the present century, a tightly integrated intellectual Hispanic world continues to exist. From Madrid to Lima to Mexico, however its members deny its survival in political terms. The currently dominant liberal Mexican view of national history, which forms the conventional wisdom and is taught in schools, tends to be anachronistic. That is, it begins with the present century and looks back. Mexicans have tried to take the 20th century social revolution as a culmination, and therefore they have consciously shaped their past to point toward 1910 and 1917. This does provide the theme, intellectual order, and form so important to some intellectuals. It connects the anarchic events of the Hispanic Revolution with a thread of purpose. Above all, such a view creates the myths and heroes new nations need. In the dominant Mexican view, all who worked for racial or social equality and for economic reforms, whether failures, great men, or bandits, have become national heroes. Those who stood for tradition, even if patriots and nation builders, are tarred with villainy. A few such villains, like Lucas Alamán and Lorenzo de Zavala, great Texan, are grudgingly respected because they dealt with facts. Against this dominant view, there has been a minority report, the themes of traditionalists, rightist writers who easily point out the failures of the reformers, but finding little to be proud of, often indulge in national self-degradation. Now, the viewpoint deals with the fact that Mexican history forms part of a worldwide Hispanic time of troubles, or admits that the Porfiriato was as essential to the emergence of a modern Mexico as Hidalgo's insurgency. As Madariaga wrote, men can only be judged against the forces, necessities, and possibilities of their times, not by later standards. Ideological viewpoints make for intellectual order, but human history by nature is random and disorderly like any organic growth. Its grandeur is made by its essential tragedy. And that is from the great T.R. Fehrenbach's Fire and Blood, A History of Mexico from 1973. I'm Joshua Treviño, and this is The Hard Country.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Hard Country. My name is Ariana Guajardo. I'm so glad that you guys are joining us. We took a little bit of a hiatus, but we are back with some drama. Josh, are you ready to get into the drama, the intrigue, the tea of everything happening right now?
This is coded differently than I expected, but yes, I'm ready to do it.
I'm having my Gen Z summer.
Go for it. Yeah. I'll come along.
Have you been having a good summer so far?
I have been having a good summer. It's about to get better. By the time this is aired, I will likely be somewhere in Europe for work, but it's never a bad place to be in Europe. It's never a bad reason to be in Europe, so I'll be glad to do it.
Well, you might think that, but I think that some of the people who are talking today might see it a little bit differently. So what we're going through today is the relationship between Mexico and Spain, how that has changed over time, what it looks like now, and why it's important for us to take a look at it. So I'm coming from this, I'm an American. I know the type of relationship that America has with Britain, and it's really interesting because for an American, right, we have Brits who are in our movies, we're in theirs. Culturally, we influence one another. We're friendly. There's a lot of crossover.
Yeah.
So I was surprised when looking into this that there's a little bit of lot more tension that exists between Mexico and Spain. So let's go into that. What does that look like now, and how's that changed over time?
It's such a huge topic, and I'm glad we're doing this. We're devoting this very special episode to the Mexican-Spanish relationship, or lack thereof, depending on what era we're talking about. You're entirely right. And of course, as Americans, our point of reference always tends to be the American Revolution. How do we, 250 years after the start of the American Revolution last April, feel about the British in the United Kingdom? And the fact is, generally speaking, we feel pretty good about it. There's no lingering bitterness toward the British. And in fact, that sentiment in American civic life really died out by the 1830s, honestly, maybe the 1840s, depending on how you count with some of the elderly veterans of the Revolution. But anti-British sentiment as such is not a continuing concern in American civics or popular culture, except to the extent that we do have a habit of casting villains with British accents in science fiction movies. That's about it.
But they're fine with it. They keep,
They
to be
keep
fair,
coming
they keep
and
auditioning.
cashing the checks. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I would further say, and this is actually going to be a topic of conversation in for me in London next week, that British civic society. I know this is a bit off topic for the show, but British civil society is obsessed with American in some very unhealthy ways. None of this is true with kind of the Mexican-Spanish relationship, and so we can start kind of from the broad picture, and then I'm happy to go into the history of it, modern manifestations of it, how it affects Mexico in particular these days. But it is a curious phenomenon, curious but nonetheless true, that Spain reputationally, and in terms of kind of like the civics of most of the Spanish American republics, has a bad rep. And that is amplified 100-fold in Mexico. You know, one of the things that was of interest to me when I was in Lima, Peru, back in April, it was the first time I'd been to Lima. I don't have a lot of South American experience. Caribbean basin, Central America is a little bit different. Mexico for sure. But I was pleasantly surprised by how positive the Peruvians are, at least in their monuments and their statuary and their commemorations toward the legacy of the Spanish, toward the legacy of the conquistadors. You know, obviously the great conqueror of Peru is Francisco Pizarro, one of the great men of history, you know, who conquers the Incan Empire through, you know, subterfuge and intrepidity with a very small number of men, very like Cortés did in Mexico. If you go to the cathedral in the historic center of Lima, he has a grand tomb as befitting the sort of great man that he was, and he's commemorated over and over in this particular space, not just at his resting place, but also within the historic center. And so you know who did this and who basically created what becomes this Peruvian nation.
So they see him almost as an ancestor, or like someone who's part of their own lineage. Then.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
He's a foundational figure, you know. And I don't want to go too far down it because I'm not an expert in Peruvian civics,
right.
Honestly, and frankly, I don't know all that much about the modern Quechua. So I'm giving observations here.
Yeah.
But the observation that I make is that even that level of public respect and commemoration and statuary is completely absent in Mexico City when it comes to the legacy of the conquistadors who conquered Tenochtitlan, you know, from 1519 to 1521. And the great Cortés, who I think is inarguably one of the most intrepid men ever to live, you know, certainly in the past 2,000 years, is buried in what's pretty close to an unmarked tomb behind an altar in a very small parish that's just off the historic center in Mexico City. I've been there. Photography is forbidden. They don't want people coming to honor him. And there's a single plaque in the wall. His body is kind of in this recess, and it just has his name on it. And you would never know that he was one of the most important men of history. And that is illustrative of the entire Mexican national civic attitude towards Spain and the Spanish that we're going to go into.
So you're talking about seeing his tomb there. Was that like a recent change where they're not allowing photography or people to visit, or that they don't want them to? So that's part of the history then. It's
always been that way. There is a positive desire among Mexican elites, and this has really been true since the Mexican Revolution. You know, kind of as Fehrenbach said, kind of this touchstone of 1910 and 1917, that he's a figure of disrepute and dishonor. And so there's this mythos that arises that real Mexico is indigenous Mexico. Real Mexico is what the Spanish found. And real Mexico and Mexican history is this process of shaking off this conquest and reclaiming, this sort of pre-Hispanic virtue. You heard this in Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who has this insanely large catalog of incredibly, ridiculous things that he said over his public life. One of the ridiculous things that he said is that it was the Spanish who brought corruption to Mexico. It's the Spanish who brought thievery and lack of virtue and violence to Mexico. And before that, it was sort of this paradox.
That's an interesting take.
Literally, it is an interesting take, and it's also literally the same picture of Mexico that you get in Neil Young's Cortés the Killer, which nobody takes as serious history. But the president of Mexico, in fact, endorsed it. And there's just a lot of buy-in to this idea that they're shaking this off. And so what that means, though, is that the things that make Mexico Mexico, and I think by any objective standard, Mexico is a synthesis. Arguably the first Mexican, the first modern Mexican, it's not the Mexica, it's the children of Malinche and Cortés, who represent this union of, in their case, the Nahua, the Aztec, and the Spanish, this sort of this mezcla, this mestizo nation that arises. You're an example of it. I'm an example of it.
Right.
So to reject the Spanish is to reject a constitutive and creative element of themselves. And I would argue from kind of a grand strategic and even a spiritual basis, this is probably causative of a lot of the ills that we see in Mexico today.
We'll go into that. What do you mean, like, or what are the ills that you see, and how is that connected?
Well, think about what the Spanish bring, and also think about who the Mexica. I mean, I'm talking the Aztecs at this point, but that whole alliance system in Mesoamerica. What they actually were. And where they were. The Valley of Mexico supported an imperium that was not geographically particularly large, but it was, not to deny it any credit, remarkably sophisticated, could feed a remarkably large number of people. I forget what the actual population of Tenochtitlan was. It's a good thing I'm not on Tucker right now, right? What, you want to conquer Tenochtitlan? And you don't know the population? But it was larger than any European city at the time, actually. So it was huge. And in fact, when Bernal Diaz writes that when they crest kind of the last ring of volcanoes and look into the valley in Mexico, they can see this incredible metropolis that just leaves them all astonished at its breadth and prosperity, which is all to the good. If you're of that heritage, it's something to be proud of. What's not to be proud of, frankly, is the brutality and the moral backwardness of it. And I think that's something that especially in the modern era, we should be unafraid to say. It was a society built upon a cult of human sacrifice. And there really isn't a lot of ways to sugarcoat that. I mean, you will get people who will say, well, it was done to do this and that. Honestly, if you want to get the most ridiculous, like PC leftist takes on things, you should actually ask ChatGPT what they think of like Aztec human sacrifice or something like that. And you'll get some sort of like really OpenAI curated California answer like, well, they only did it because they needed the rain. Like that's a reason to kill a kid over an altar. I
know what I'm doing right after the episode then. Going straight to ChatGPT.
Oh God, I thought you meant sacrificing a child. Good heavens. No, yes.
No, thank God for the Europeans who have helped develop my moral philosophy now.
Exactly. And so, there are times in history where there's a right side and a wrong side. And in the case of Aztec religion and the culture upon which it rested, it was something that I think unquestionably, and I don't, this is not something that we should say just as like ideological conservatives in the modern day, but anybody of basic humanity like that has to go. That should not have persisted. And in the case of the Mexica, even within the context of a broader Mesoamerican civilization, a broader American civilization, pre-contact American civilization, in which human sacrifice was routine. I mean, it's everywhere. You see it in evidence of like Mississippian culture in North America. The Incas definitely practiced it in South America. So these were not in meaningful contact with the Mesoamericans or with the Nahua or with the Aztec back then. But they all practiced it. So even within the broad kind of hemispheric context of religion that tended to these things, the Mexica managed to mark themselves as unusually bloody and savage. Like that's pretty tough to do when you're already killing people as a matter of course in your worship. And so they did that. I think we can acknowledge it's a good thing that went away. But what ends up happening. And I can dive into any part of this you want. I'm also happy to lecture for an hour on it because it's something. It's an extremely interesting topic. Well, what ends up happening is obviously the Spanish, they complete the conquest and they do something that's very interesting, and they do something that is really not the same as what you see in say Anglo colonization elsewhere. Their concept, and again, we should accept this within the bounds of prudential realism in our interpretation of history. But conceptually, what the Spanish were trying to do was actually somewhat laudable. They were not intending to replace the population of the Mesoamerican basin or the Valley of Mexico. I'm sorry, with a new settler class. They weren't displacing the native population. What their intent was to Christianize them basically, and raise them to the status of kingdoms, which they formally did. Now, I'm not saying this in like a revisionist history of denial, because there obviously was a ruling class and there's a Helot class below that, a situation which continues to this day, might I add, in Mexico. But there certainly was a positive intent that persisted across centuries to engage in this catechetical mission, which is something positive that the Spanish did that the English never did, and and that the French kind of halfway tried to do in sort of fits and starts much later on. And so I think you have to give them credit for that. And so what did they end up leaving? I mean, first of all, human sacrifice is no longer the basis of religion in the hemisphere, which is good. Although it is coming back in like the cult of Santa Muerte, and you see that among a lot of the cartels. So by no means a fight that's over and won from a historical perspective, but it was suppressed. You did get modern institutions, colleges and universities in Lima and Mexico City. You obviously got the churches. You actually had Mexico in particular, but also Peru and modern Bolivia to a certain extent, which is considered kind of an extension of Peru at that point, integrated into a global system of commerce and finance. People forget that the Philippines for a long time was governed from the Viceroyalty of New Spain, headquartered in Mexico City. And it's because Mexico was the intermediate step in a global trade of the Spanish galleons that takes wares and silver to and from China, takes them through Manila, goes the Northern Pacific route, puts in at Acapulco, if I remember correctly, and then goes overland to Mexico City, and then ends up in Europe where it funds like efforts to conquer the Netherlands or something like that. But it's actually this incredibly central part of the world system. And what happens, I think I've talked about this on the show before, when the revolutions come in 1810, 1820, Alexander Micaberitze in his Napoleonic Wars says that the strategic effect is to drop Latin America, what becomes Latin America. It wasn't considered that at the time, but what becomes Latin America, Spanish America, they drop out of world history. They no longer occupy the central place. And I think that's, taking the sense in which he means it, that's actually true. And so it is the Spanish, I'm not a Spanish partisan, but I'll say it is the Spanish who make this part of the world matter. It is the Spanish who bring it into modernity. It's the Spanish who are the essential elements. And I agree with Fehrenbach, even more than the indigenous elements, which is a controversial thing to say. But there's hundreds of indigenous. There's only one Spanish. Yes.
Yeah, I think that you can even end that sentence with it's the Spanish that make this part of America. Like we wouldn't have the modern Mexican without Spanish. Like these are two distinctly very different cultures, like what you're saying, from an indigenous person to the Mexican today.
We wouldn't have the modern Texas without the Spanish.
Right, that as well.
Yeah.
So, but it seems like now that there's an effort that started potentially with AMLO, which we'll go into a little bit, and then continues through Sheinbaum, that's trying to revise some of that history, or say that their lineage and that what it means to be Mexican comes from the indigenous people. Why did that start? Where does that come from?
It comes from what I think Fehrenbach correctly identified as the inability to discern a proper ordered end, a telos, and a philia. We talk about this a lot. Aristotle said a nation requires two things: philia, which is the fellow feeling among fellow countrymen, and then telos, which is kind of the natural end of a thing. A nation requires both, and Mexico has not been able to find it. Mexico's done okay on the philia part. It's been fits and starts, but Mexicans recognize other Mexicans from a civic standpoint. But it's the telos part. No one can really say
like what it's ordered towards.
What it's ordered towards. I mean, what is it for? What's America for, Ariana? What's America for?
Preserving liberty.
Preserving liberty. It's to secure.
I was like hoping
liberties.
That's the right question.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. Well, it is. And it could, because we have a mission statement in the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution for those of you watching at home, but it's the Declaration of Independence, as Abraham Lincoln said, that it's constituted the nation. The Constitution is just a fulfillment of that declaration, but the declaration provides the telos and the proper ordered end of the United States. There is nothing like that. I mean, they've got documents, and they've got the Grito de Dolores and the 1917 Constitution and so on. Although that Constitution, which still exists technically, is kind of like the ship of Theseus. It's been amended hundreds of times. I've got a copy of it at home, and it's just amendment after amendment after amendment. It's very easy to amend, and it happens a lot. You can't say what Mexico is for, and so there's been an effort. There's a lot of reasons that civic nationalism has turned against the Spanish and has been against the Spanish for over a century. But I think core at it, and also part of the reason that we as Americans don't hate the British, is because they haven't figured out what Mexico's for. What is Mexico for? Mexico, it's easy to define what Mexico is against, and that becomes a kludge and a societal substitute for having a positive civic mission. What Mexico is against is Hispanidad. It's the Spanish. It's the all the corrupting influence that AMLO and even Claudia Sheinbaum, now in office, says that the Spanish brought, corrupting this incredible Mesoamerican paradise that existed prior to Cortés, where they would cut people's hearts out, I guess, on stone tables. And they're also against the United States. As well, so between the Spaniard and the Yankee, it's just surrounded by enemies, and the national mission is to defeat them, and it's a very thin reed upon which to build a polity.
So when does that, I guess, that sentiment start in or them being built to just be against something else? Is that something that starts during the first revolution against Spain, or where does that come into their rhetoric?
Yeah, it does. The Mexican War of Independence that starts in 1810 with Father Hidalgo's revolt is very explicitly anti-Spanish. It is a class revolt. It's against this peninsular class. It's people who are essentially born in Spain, and they're given an elevated place in Spanish administration under the Bourbon reforms in particular. There's a very interesting critique, by the way, that's worth exploring. And I'm not sure what I think of it, but I find it very intriguing. This idea that the Habsburgs had actually cracked the code on how to govern the Americas, which is very loosely and effectively allow all of the American viceroyalties and kingdoms there to essentially to exist in a quasi-independent status. They're contributory to the treasury of the imperial metropolis in the center, but at the same time, they're essentially left to tend to their own devices. The Bourbons come in after the War of the Spanish Succession. Of course, they're originally French, so nobody's perfect. But the Bourbons are a French family. This is the house that's still in charge today, actually, the Spanish royal family, the Casa de Bourbon, and especially under Carlos III, they undertake a variety of administrative reforms, which have the effect of very similar to kind of what the British did, the British mistake in the 1760s and early 1770s.
What year range are we in at this point now?
Oh, I'm sorry. We're talking about the middle and second half of the 18th century.
Okay.
And so in the name of rationalization, what they do is they make people feel the hand of the imperial center in ways that they hadn't previously. And concurrent with that was this continuing system of privilege granted to the Peninsulares, who are, again, the individuals who were actually born in Spain and first claim to a lot of, taxation revenue and titles and governance and so on, that eventually caused the local elites to turn against Spanish rule. So, when Father Hidalgo rebels, it's I'll oversimplify. It's a lower class rebellion. It's effectively crushed. I mean, there are several points in the decade of 1810 to 1820 where it looks like the Mexican War for Independence is not going to succeed. It finally does succeed because General Iturbide and a critical mass of local elites decide that they too are going to turn against the Spanish crown, and that's the end of it. But again, because it's not for anything. It's not for a vision of liberty. It's not for kind of an ordered view of on a philosophical basis of how man should be. It ends up being for nothing except power for its own sake. In Iturbide, he issues what's called these like these three guarantees when he persuades the critical mass of the elites to follow him to independence. And even he, by the way, is not looking to make a total break. Like, there's a brief effort to actually secure a Spanish prince, like a cadet branch of the Spanish, House of Bourbon, to come and rule Mexico. The Spanish reject it. They probably should have accepted the offer, but the Spanish reject it. So Iturbide then declares himself emperor, which who hasn't been there, right? And so he tries to do that. But he's not a revolutionary. He's not creating a new order. He's not, and neither is anybody else in Mexico. In fact, you don't really get that in post-independence Mexican history until you get to Benito Juarez in the era of the reforms in the 1850s and 60s, concurrent with the French invasion and occupation of Mexico. And at that point is when all hell really breaks loose.
Well, what happens then?
Well, what happens then is you see the Mexican state for the first time. Not that it was well governed before that, but you see it fall into the hands of truly liberal. I don't mean liberal in the 2025 terms. I mean, these are not American Democrats, but liberal Republican ideologues who want the curtailment of the church. They are against tradition. This is where Fehrenbach in the original reading said that the defenders of tradition and kind of organic Hispanic political society are regarded as the villains. in this case, and this is one of the roots of that, because Juarez comes in and he wants to set himself up. This is one of the great heroes of Mexico, by the way. I'm not. The more I learn, the less persuaded I am of his virtues. But he is a late-breaking example of a classic Enlightenment figure who simply does not believe that that sort of the natural, I shouldn't say natural, but the organic order of Mexican society should actually inform Mexican governance. And so as part of that effort to remake Mexican society, to suppress the church, to graft this Tocquevillian vision of what's essentially Anglo-American civics onto Mexico, not for the first time, by the way, or not for the last time, I should say, because it happens again and again and again. Anti-Spanish sentiment is part of that. And what's interesting is that what ends up following Juarez's era, he kicks the French out, he shoots Maximilian, who's arguably the best ruler Mexico ever would have had. Habsburg, by the way, not Bourbon, and then ironically, but totally predictably, what follows Juarez is the Porfiriato, which is a dictatorship that lasts essentially a generation. And Porfirio Diaz, who's the autocrat in this time, he's not a good man, but he's an effective man, and he keeps himself in power for a generation. And he elevates this class of, they call them the científicos, which are effectively the kind of the enlightened administrators of Mexico. And he, to the extent that he has a political theory, and I think he does, it's that the Mexicans can't possibly be entrusted with democracy or self-rule. So you've got to have this elite class that rules over them. And key to a lot of the elite class is a returning class of Spaniards who invest in railroads, they invest in finance, they invest in infrastructure, mines, the whole nine yards. And by the time the revolution rolls around in 1910, when Diaz is overthrown and sent into exile by Madero and his compatriots, there's a lot of Spanish who are caught up in it as well, and some of them are killed, many of them are kicked out. And you see this again and again. I think, I don't remember if it's before the show started or after, but you mentioned that Spain and Mexico, what are they as trading partners?
Oh, yeah. So one of the things that I found interesting about this kind of tension is in the background of all of this, and some of the stuff that we'll get into that's more like in the last few years, in certain sentiments, is during all of that, Spain is Mexico's second biggest trading partner. First being the United States, second is Spain. Yeah. So again, there's this weird muddled history, and then they're continuing to make, Mexican officials are continuing to make comments about Spain and stuff like that, but then they continue to work very closely together. Well, it's like Fehrenbach said, because there is a unifying Hispanidad. Whether or not it's reflected in politics, it makes absolute sense from a societal standpoint, from a linguistic standpoint, certainly from a standpoint of values. For if you're Spanish and you want to invest in some place that's low cost but relatively familiar, come to Mexico and do that. That's been going on for 500 years. Right, and there's still hundreds of Spanish companies that operate out of Mexico. Oh yeah. So that kind of dynamic, again, it's super closely related. Absolutely, and the flip side of that. So Spanish come to Mexico with money and investment. Mexicans go to Spain to preserve their capital, to avoid prosecution on occasion, and to retire. A Spanish passport is very popular among Mexican elites. And the way they get it is through their, I was going to ask, the way that you achieve Spanish passports, you just have to have, you have to prove is it a grandparent that lived in Spain, or what? How close of lineage do you have to get Spanish citizenship? My understanding is that the way that the law works right now, you have to have had a Spanish grandparent, like a Spanish national grandparent, but there's all sorts of special exceptions to it. For many years, if you could prove descent from Sephardic Jews who were expelled from Spain, you could get it. So you have that quality, I have that quality, because we're descended from the same Sephardic Jew. Right. I actually have multiple friends right now who are trying to get Spanish passports. It's definitely more than one. Yeah. No. Well, I certainly understand. It's a lot of people are interested in alternative passports, especially in Mexico. Before we get into who the more surprising people that are trying to get those, I just want to bring this. So let's jump ahead a little over 100 years now. Okay. So we have this background and this history where I guess there part of it's like a class-based struggle where we have and of course that's also heavily influences, of course, the socialist mentality that ends up existing in Mexico. But the Morena coalition in particular seems to now be at least bringing this animosity up again and trying. Right. It seems like they're trying to color themselves as something separate from the Spanish, and the Spanish are the ones that hurt them. They're not Spanish at all, the way that they're praising it. Yeah. But it's just, there's been such a shift. So in 2018, during AMLO's during what is it? His inauguration.
Right. In December, yeah.
Right, but the King of Spain was there. So he invited King Felipe. He was there at his inauguration.
Right.
But then in 2019, Lopez Obrador started, he had sent a letter to both the King of Spain and to Pope Francis asking them for apologies for the abuses that they committed during the Spanish conquest and colonization of Mexico.
Right, right.
So it seems like this is this 2018 to 2019 kind of shift where we're, at least it's being brought back up, this history.
Yeah.
But had it gone way before this comes back up, or?
It was never totally absent, but
Okay.
I don't think there's any question. I think to your point that Andrés Manuel López Obrador and the Morenistas have revived and amplified it in ways that are fairly, I don't think there's any other word for it, fairly deranged at this point. I mean, asking for an apology for the conquest of Mexico.
Like how many hundreds of years
Writing
later?
to the Pope. Well, I mean, it's on the 500th anniversary. It's why he does this.
Yeah.
And so what he's trying to do is again, like align himself. And Claudia Sheinbaum, who has no answers to this sort at all, she's also aligning herself in the same way with this idea that the indigenous population are the only true Mexicans. And so you and I were talking about this before the show. I know you don't know the full extent of whether you have indigenous blood. You know, I'm 1/16 apparently Tarahumara Indian. I mean, it depends on who you talk to. But I mean, there's DNA evidence for it and things like that. And that's normal. Like that's that
Right.
kind of admixture is normal.
But most people are still majority European that are or at least a lot of them are.
It depends.
Okay.
But this is an interesting point. Where you and I are from, and like where our families are from in the north, Nuevo Santander, Nuevo León.
Right.
Yes, that's normal to be mostly European. So the fact, I'm 1/16 Indian in ancestry, so I think that would push me up to great grandparents. I believe.
More than Elizabeth Warren, so you're in.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, right. Yeah, we recognize each other. Like that's normal. But if you go down to the Valley of Mexico, like the modern day Valley of Mexico, it's extremely common to see people who are, full-blooded indigenous, 60, 70, 80, 90%, whatever, and to have that admixture prevail, which is fine. I mean, they're equally Mexican. I mean, there's nothing less Mexican about, and this is what I think this is part of the derangement of sort of the kind of the civic hate campaign that goes on against the Spanish in Mexico and modern day Mexico is, if you have 100% European blood, it's unlikely, but let's say you do. You're just as Mexican as somebody who was like full on Zapotec or Nahua or Mayan or anything else. Like that's the thing about Mexico, is that Mexico is a mestizo nation. I'm not saying this from an ideological standpoint. It's just purely descriptive, and it's extremely heterogeneous. And there are literally hundreds of linguistic groups, ethnic groups in Mexico that persist to this day from antiquity. In many cases, preserved by the Spanish with their systems of government. I mean, there's a reason the Tlaxcalans, the Tlaxcalteca, who were sort of the villains in the Morena version of history, still persist because of this. And what AMLO has done and the Morenistas have done is throw it out the window. And so you end up with multiple tiers. There are some Mexicans who are more Mexican than others, and the criterion for that is birth and ethnicity. It is a form, we should call it what it is, a form of racism. And it is tolerated because it's on the left. That's why nobody calls it out, because it's on the left, so it's acceptable racism.
Right.
But racism it is, and it is a denial of fully half of the constitutive Mexican ancestry and heritage.
Oh, well, just to support that, so on October 12th in 2024, so that was Columbus Day, Sheinbaum was saying, for many years they told us that they came over here to civilize us. No, there were already great cultures here. And she said, Mexico is great because of its original peoples. So it seems like, again, she's still making that distinguishing
Who's
thing.
Us in this case?
That's the other thing I'm wondering.
Yeah.
So I guess that's what I was speaking about earlier, is that this Morena coalition, the people who are still running it are like speaking about themselves as if they are these like fully indigenous people who have been oppressed by Spain for this whole time, which doesn't seem to be in line with what I know about their histories.
In the case of Sheinbaum in particular, President Sheinbaum, it is fantasy land LARPing. I mean, look, Claudia Sheinbaum has been on the receiving end of some truly ugly rhetoric for the fact that she's the granddaughter of, I believe, Bulgarian Jews, Ashkenazi, who come over in the mid 20th century. Forgive me if I'm getting some of the details wrong. Vicente Fox tweeted out stuff like she's not a real Mexican. So, I mean, all that should be set aside. But what she's doing is sort of like the obverse of that type of falsehood. You're claiming this thing for yourself when you yourself, as president of Mexico, are an example of the small c Catholicity of what Mexico is and could be. And if one wished to, which the Mexican elites currently don't because they don't have the vision to do so. You could make of Mexico that sort of nation. But instead what they're choosing is something very small and very regrettable and very narrow, and it results in exactly what we're seeing here, which is a subsistence that can't point toward positive achievements, really, on the strategic level for itself, nor toward a positive vision, but it can point toward an imaginary enemy in the Spanish, who have not posed a threat to Mexico for at least 150 years.
Yeah.
And the United States, which in candor wants to do nothing more than forget Mexico exists except when it's time to do cross-border trade. Yeah.
Well, I did promise both tea and drama during
please.
the show. So I wanted to bring up again, we're talking about Sheinbaum. So what happened around her inauguration because there was some tension and stuff whenever she snubbed someone.
Oh, you're talking about the invitation to
Go ahead, let's tell the story.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's appalling, and in recounting the story, I have to say, like the one element of Mexican governance that I have repeatedly praised on this show and also in private meetings and elsewhere is the diplomatic corps. I think Mexico has an outstanding diplomatic corps, maybe better than ours in a lot of different ways. And there's so many things that Mexican governance can't do, but they can do diplomacy right. And so this anecdote.
It's a deviation from that.
Well, it's a positive choice.
Okay,
is what I'm getting at. Like they knew what they were doing.
Okay.
When you issue invitations for the inauguration of a head of state, you invite other heads of state. I mean, that's just a universal constant across nations. And so they did. They invited other heads of states, but they didn't invite the Spanish head of state. They invited the Spanish Prime Minister, Sanchez. The Spanish head of state is Felipe VI of La Casa de Bourbon, and they didn't invite him. And so as a consequence, Sanchez, I set aside my opinions on Spanish socialist governance, but Sanchez did the right thing. He didn't go. And he didn't go, and he told him why. He says, I can't go because you didn't invite our head of state. Well, that was a choice that they made. They wanted to show that they weren't going. They wanted to insult the Spanish monarch, who, in candor, by no means am I an expert on King Felipe VI, but he probably would have been a mild enthusiast for Spanish investment in Mexico. There's this thing doesn't go two ways. When I go to Spain, when you talk with Spanish officialdoms, Spanish intellectuals on the left and right, there's no animus toward Mexico and the Mexicans at all. In fact, there's frequently enthusiasm for Mexican culture and history. Like it's regarded as something very interesting and exotic and worthy of study, all of which is true, actually. I share that opinion. And so what I see over and over is sort of a disappointment and a bafflement to find that they're hate objects, which is, but the reality is it's not actually about them.
Right, but it is funny to me that just some of it almost seems a little bit like petty drama the way that it's coming out. So jumping back a little bit before Sheinbaum, during AMLO's administration, there was a time when he was attacking, I think, some of the trade and economics going on between Mexico and Spain.
Yes.
And he was calling for a, quote, pause in diplomatic relations with Spain.
Right.
Which didn't end up turning into a real thing. It was more just to say it. But it felt, for me, it was just reminding me of in Friends whenever they're like on a break. And anyway, it was just a funny thing for me to read about we need a pause in this relationship that we're having right now.
Right. What does that even mean?
What, the pause?
Does the ambassador go home? I mean, is it you PNG somebody? Like nobody can say it because it's not a real. It's not a real term, right? But yeah, I mean, AMLO did that.
But he said it.
Can I read something that the official Mexican
please.
government? Sorry, it's on my phone, so I'll have to call this up. But
this is a tweet you're reading, right?
From June 30th, right?
Of current year, 2025.
Current year, 2020. Yes, we were recording this in the year 2025. So this is a tweet from Gobierno Mex. It's the Gobierno de Mexico, so this is the official Mexican government account. I'll read it in English. But there's two anniversaries. So anniversary number one is 700 years since the foundation of Tenochtitlan, which is modern day Mexico City. Tenochtitlan is what the Spanish conquered, and it becomes Ciudad de Mexico. And then they have another thing. So on June 30th, 1520, was the Noche Triste. I have to explain this a little bit. Do you know what the Noche Triste is?
I don't actually.
Okay, so for the viewers and also for Ariana's benefit.
Yes, please.
In the conquest of Tenochtitlan, to give you the real synoptic version, the Noche Triste is an episode where the Spanish within Tenochtitlan and their allies are expelled by the Aztecs, and it's the Noche. It's the night of sorrows. Is what Noche Triste stands for. And so the Spanish flee across this causeway, which is actually now Avenida Madero. You and I walked down it in outside the Zocalo, and so they flee. But at that point, it's a causeway with water on each side, and so it's a horrific battle because you can imagine like having to fight your way like through every foot on that causeway. And I forget what the Spanish casualties were, but it was significant. And they end up what ends up happening is they're expelled. And then they regroup at, I think at Tlaxcala, maybe on Cholula. But anyway, they regroup and they conduct the siege of Tenochtitlan, and then a year later they enter the city and the conquest is over. So this is the 505th anniversary. Was yesterday, as we're recording on July 1st. So it was yesterday, June 30th. And this is the tweet from El Gobierno de Mexico. I'll give you the English version. June 30th, 1520, known as the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, was actually a great victory for the Mexica, these are the Aztecs, who defeated and expelled the Spanish forces led by Hernán Cortés from Tenochtitlan. For 500 years, the Spanish narrative obscured this glorious episode. So the Spanish have been lying about it the whole time. But now it's a glorious episode. Since 2021, this event has been celebrated as Noche de Victoria. So now it's no longer the Noche Triste, it's the night of victory. Because again, the Mexican state is now explicitly identifying with the Aztecs. A symbol of indigenous resistance and the legacy of greatness of our indigenous peoples. So congratulations, like you're now the Mexica. You see this over and over. A very good friend who was with me in Mexico City back in March told me about an exchange that he had at the Metropolitan Cathedral. You've seen this in the Zocalo. The Metropolitan Cathedral is built
gorgeous.
It's gorgeous. It's built upon the ruins of the Templo Mayor, of the Aztec human sacrifice pyramid they used. So they raised it to the ground as it deserved, and they built this beautiful cathedral atop it. And
classic Catholics.
Classic. Every time, right? Like they stop the abortions, they stop the human sacrifice. Like, what's the deal with these guys? And so he said he talked to a guard who was there, and one of these I forget. I think it's the Air Force that guards the cathedral. It's a very strange. They parcel out these kind of government jobs to the armed forces at this point.
Okay.
Because it's very characteristic of kind of late stage leftist autocracy in Latin America. Well, I mean they're the revenue sources for the armed forces, so you got to keep them happy. And the guard said that, and then the phrase that this guard used was, "Oh yeah, they built this cathedral on top of our temple."
On top of our temple?
On top of our temple, right.
When is the last time someone was actually practicing these actual Aztec religions?
In the cult of Santa Muerte among the cartels around the countryside.
Well, that's true. There's a different revision of it, I guess.
Yesterday, yeah. No, they're still back. I mean, this is a bit orthogonal to show, but when you see a lot of these practitioners, and I encourage the viewers to not research this very deeply, but you are starting to see in some of the darker corners explicit revivals of actually the Aztec pantheon, which is quite chilling.
I guess whenever even we were there, or whenever I was there with you with the last TPPF trip that I was able to go on, even outside there were vendors that had a couple of different
correct.
Yeah, a couple of different like idol kind of stuff with them.
Correct. So in Lima, you don't see any of that.
Wow.
The cathedral's actually a Catholic space in Lima, not so in Mexico City.
We can only hope, I guess, for that. But yeah. So looking, before we add this into what context and some other stuff, I have one more piece of tea that I want to get to.
Oh, sure.
Which is, we were talking about how there's, like, while these Mexican officials are trying to differentiate themselves from the Spanish, from their Spanish conquerors, as they're trying to put it, who decided to try and go and get a Spanish citizenship? Yes.
Well, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, enemy of Spain, his wife,
self-declared,
reputedly, I haven't seen proof of this, but reputedly was a major force in encouraging him and his government to go as anti-Spanish as they did. And anyway, he's out of office now, and apparently within the past, I don't know, month or two, she went and applied for Spanish citizenship. Amazing, huh? And now on the one hand, this is not that unusual because there are at least two former Mexican presidents right now who live in Spain. Peña Nieto and I believe Calderón maintains a residence in Spain. It's actually quite common.
I did not know that.
Mexican presidents leave the country typically after their presidency is done for a variety of reasons.
Is like the equivalent to people from New York like retiring in Florida? Like, is that the pipeline for,
if New York I mean, New York does not have a culture of like assaulting Florida all the time and denigrating Florida. Like I can't believe Florida took New York away from us. Like they need. So no, it's not like that. But it is a weird thing. And so had there not been sort of this effort, because Peña Nieto, I mean, for all of his flaws, never really was anti-Spanish, neither was Felipe Calderón, but AMLO was, and so the fact now that his wife is applying for Spanish citizenship, I believe, this is an assumption on my part because I can't prove it, but I believe it was probably some Spanish official who leaked this, and can you blame him? I mean, honestly, after taking all the abuse from this guy, and now they want Spanish citizenship. But unfortunately, it's just characteristic of Mexican elites.
So if you had to make a prediction, do you think she gets the citizenship?
Well, that's a really good question. If I guess I'm not violating the Logan Act if I suppose here. I mean, if I were the Spanish, I'd actually give them the citizenship. Tie them to the place. Let them park their capital there.
If he's wrong in the future, I need people to comment underneath this.
Maybe.
Or we can get Josh is all right slogan
we'll see.
going.
It's but I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. I haven't heard any rumor about it, but I can tell you without betraying confidences that the Spanish have noticed, and they are drawing the appropriate conclusions from it. One of the conclusions from which is that they don't really mean, the elites don't mean the rhetoric, and they're playing their own population for fools, which is entirely characteristic of the quality of their rule.
And again, while this is all happening, their second largest trading partner continues to be
Spain. Yeah.
So with that, why is it important for us as Americans, whenever we're, I guess, looking at Mexico and examining this relationship, why is it important for us to take note of that?
Well, excellent question. It's important for us to take note for a couple of big reasons, in my view. One is that this kind of belief, whether you see it in the attitude towards Spain, and I've said this a couple times in the show, it's not really about Spain. Like, there's nothing that modern Spain has done in the past century and a half to really merit this kind of treatment. It's like a historical thing. And so it's a hate object that is essentially undeserving of the hate. No surprise, I like Spain, but they just haven't done anything to deserve it. And so if it's not really about Spain, we have to ask what it's about and what it really is about, because you saw it in Evo Morales' Bolivia. You obviously see it in Mexico. You see it pop up, to a lesser extent in some other arenas in Latin America. It's a signal. And what the signal is the enmity towards Spain is really an enmity toward the West and its entire heritage. And that whole basket of values, human rights, religion, dignity of the individual, the idea of democracy. If you're against Spain as such in the 21st century, I don't mean in the beginning of the 19th century, I don't mean in the 18th century, I mean in the beginning of the 21st century, if you're against Spain as such, what you are signaling is that you're against that entire basket of values and that heritage of European civilization that has done so much positive for your nation, and frankly is the reason your nation exists. And that's true for us in the United States too. All the Americas are the children of Europe in some way. That's just a historical fact.
So coloring their distaste for Spain also will then it explains their distaste for the United States.
I would argue that I think that's right. I would argue that the kind of the anti-Spanish thing is a trailing indicator rather than leading one. It's not that they turn against Spain and then turn against this basket of values. They're catechized, and catechizing is the right word because it is a quasi-religious, it's a cultic belief. They're catechized against the values of faith, dignity, liberty, the whole nine yards, and then that comes in an anti-Spanish wrapper. With the United States, I would argue it's a little bit different with Mexico in particular, because unlike Spain, the United States is, and I say this objectively, I mean as an American, the United States does constitute a threat to the Mexican ruling class, just by virtue of our size, our presence, our geography, and so there's a qualitatively different relationship. So although I do think the two phenomena are related, You can make a case, a plausible case, that there is rational Mexican concern with the United States and its role in Mexican civics and society and policy and the whole nine yards, which is all true. And the show is probably part of that concern. But you really can't make that case for
Spain,
for the modern Kingdom of Spain.
But if people want to learn more about that kind of relationship, or have more information about the Mexico and Texas relationship as well, the Mexican-American relationship, where can people go?
They can get on a plane to Mexico City and they can see. No, look, there's no one single source for this. But what I would recommend, honestly, if people want to read about this and get a good look into this, and I don't recall if I've ever said this before on the show, but if I have, I apologize to viewers who are hearing this twice. The best coverage of Mexico, journalistic coverage that I find in Spanish, is from El País, which is a broadly leftist Spanish daily out of Madrid. It's very good. And you can see that they cover it relatively well, and they tell it fairly straight too. So I would go to sources like that. I would read Fehrenbach. I would read actually Enrique Kraut's, and he has the Biografía de Poder, the biography of power, which is a very good history of Mexico. And so you can start getting a sense of all this. One last thing I'll say, and I've heard this as rumor, but I've heard it more than once. I don't know if this is true, but if it is true, many of you will hear it on this show first. The rumored change and kind of the ultimate stick it to them to the Spanish is supposedly going to be the renaming of Mexico City to Tenochtitlan. Yes.
Well, if there's talk about that in the coming weeks, you guys can know that you heard it here first, and share this episode with everyone to share Josh's potential prediction or insight. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching The Hard Country. Josh, thank you for walking through the history, what it means today.
Thanks, Ariana.
For more insight like this, please continue to watch The Hard Country and share it. We will see you next time.